The containment field is failing. We have a full breach on level 7. All personnel to evacuation bays.
The last thing the Veth Collective expected to find defending the refugee processing station on Outer Dock 7 was a 53-year-old human maintenance contractor eating a cold breakfast sandwich. His name was Raymond Okafor. Most people called him Ray. He wore a faded orange safety vest with a cracked reflective strip on the left shoulder, carried a thermos of coffee that had gone cold sometime around the 3rd hour of his shift, and had a habit of humming old songs under his breath when he thought no one was listening. He was not a soldier. He had never held a rank. The most dangerous thing he'd ever been certified to operate was a pressurized welding rig, and even that certification was 7 years out of date. He was the reason 4,000 refugees survived the breach of Outer Dock 7, not because he was strong, not because he was trained, but because when every instinct in every species present was screaming to run, Ray Okafor looked at the line where the shields had failed, looked at the crowd of frightened people behind him, and quietly decided that today was not the day. This is his story. Ray had been working Outer Dock 7 for 11 months when everything broke. 11 months of 12-hour shifts, of crawling through maintenance corridors that weren't built for human proportions, of learning to navigate the particular bureaucratic chaos of a multi-species deep space processing hub that had been designed by committee and expanded 6 times without anyone updating the original blueprints. He'd taken the job after the divorce was finalized. His daughter Alina, 17 and furious at both of them, had stopped answering his calls for 2 months before she started again, slowly, cautiously, the way you approach something that's bitten you before. His apartment back in Columbus was half-furnished and perpetually smelled like someone else's cooking from the unit above. The contract with Helix Infrastructure Solutions had offered double pay for remote postings, hazard allowance, and the dubious benefit of being very far away from everything he was trying not to think about. Outer Dock 7 wasn't glamorous. It was a transit hub for displaced persons, refugees mostly, from 3 different regional conflicts that the major powers were carefully describing as civil instabilities rather than wars. The station processed about 900 people a day through medical screening, documentation verification, and temporary housing assignment. It smelled of recycled air and institutional cleaner, and the particular combination of anxiety and boredom that large groups of frightened people produce when they have nothing to do but wait. Ray's job was keeping the physical systems running. Environmental controls, pressure seals, docking clamps, lighting grids, the endless network of pipes and conduits and access panels that made the difference between a functioning station and 400 cubic meters of very organized dying. He had a territory of about 60 maintenance access points, a tablet loaded with work orders that reproduced faster than he could close them, and a junior tech named S. Siveth who was technically his supervisor, but in practice deferred to him on anything that involved actually touching the equipment. S. Siveth was Veth. Most of the administrative staff at Dock 7 were Veth. The collective ran the official processing contracts for this sector, and they were meticulous, organized, and deeply committed to protocol. They were also, Ray had learned, genuinely uncertain what to make of him. Veth culture organized itself around the concept of Velthon, which translated roughly as appropriate function, the idea that every being had a role correctly suited to their nature, and that fulfilling that role with precision was the highest form of dignity. A maintenance worker was a maintenance worker. A security officer was a security officer. The categories were clear, the responsibilities were bounded, and everyone knew exactly where the edges were. Ray had a habit of not noticing edges. He covered for the night environmental team when 3 of them went down with a respiratory infection, because he'd worked nights before and they were short. He fixed the food dispensers in the level 4 holding area on his own time, because the work order kept getting deprioritized, and the children in that section had been eating cold ration paced for a week. He learned enough of the Kalahari trade dialect, the informal common tongue that half the refugees spoke, to explain maintenance procedures without needing a translator, which saved time and also, he suspected, made people feel slightly less like they were being processed by machinery. As Siveth had said to him about 3 months in the carefully precise way that Veth expressed something they found genuinely puzzling, maintenance technician Okafor, you consistently perform tasks outside the boundary of your designated function. I have wed the work logs. In the last 62 days, you have completed 47 tasks that were not assigned to you, and that did not affect the systems under your direct responsibility. Ray had considered this. Were the things broken? Oh yes. And did fixing them help people? As Siveth had taken a moment. In 17 of those cases, the systems repaired directly affected the comfort or welfare of current processing residents. In 22 cases, the repairs prevented secondary failures that would have created documented delays. In 8 cases. So yeah, Ray said, the things were broken. S. Siveth had filed a note in his personnel record that read, Technician Okafor demonstrates non-standard approach to function boundary interpretation. Performance remains excellent. No action recommended. It was the closest thing to a compliment the Veth system knew how to give. That was the world Ray woke up to every morning for 11 months. Work orders, cold coffee. The particular satisfaction of a system that ran smoothly because someone had paid attention. Alina had started sending him pictures from her school volleyball games, and he'd started taping them to the inside of his maintenance locker, and life was not good exactly, but it was functional, and functional felt like enough. The Kethavor arrived on a Tuesday. Nobody at Dock 7 had ever seen Kethavor in person. They knew the name, a militant faction from the Outer Reach conflicts, designated as non-state aggressors by the Collective Security Council, operating under the ideological framework that displaced populations represented security threats to be managed rather than people to be helped. The intelligence briefings, which Ray had never been given because maintenance contractors didn't receive intelligence briefings, apparently described them as pragmatic rather than ideological. They didn't hate the refugees so much as they found their existence inconvenient, and they had the firepower to do something about that inconvenience. The first sign was the shield fluctuation on level 2, docking corridor C. Ray was in maintenance corridor 7F when it happened, wedged between 2 recycling conduits replacing a flow regulator that had been on the work order list for 3 weeks. His tablet chirped. He glanced at it and saw the power draw spike, which meant something on that corridor was pulling more energy than it should, which meant either a shield emitter was failing or someone was trying to push through a shield emitter that was failing. He climbed out of the conduit, checked his tablet again, and started walking toward C corridor. He was not thinking about Kethavor. He was thinking about whether the emitter was a hardware fault or a calibration issue, and whether he had the right components in his kit, and whether there was any chance the coffee in his thermos had somehow stayed warm through 2 hours in a maintenance shaft. He rounded the corner into the C corridor monitoring station and found S. Siveth standing very still in front of a display panel, and 3 other Veth administrative staff pressed against the wall behind them, and a junior security officer named Perk on her comm unit saying something in Veth that Ray didn't catch, but that had the cadence of very bad news. What's the shield status? Ray asked. S. Siveth turned to look at him. The Veth didn't show emotion the way humans did. Their facial structures didn't map to human expressions in any direct way. But there was something in the particular stillness of S. Siveth's posture that Ray had learned to read as the Veth equivalent of barely controlled fear. Outer shield ring C is at 11% integrity, S. Siveth said. There are Kethavor breach craft on the far side. 7 confirmed vessels. They have been conducting targeted pulse attacks on the emitter array for the last 14 minutes. Ray looked at the display. The numbers were not good. At 11%, a shield ring was more suggestion than barrier. At 0%, the corridor became a direct atmospheric breach point, technically survivable for most species in short duration. But opening a pressurized hull section to hard vacuum tended to create a number of secondary problems, including the one where people on the other side of the breach were hostile and armed. "What's on the other side of C corridor?" Ray asked. He knew the answer. He was hoping he was wrong. "Level 4 holding," Siveth said. "Current population 4,312 registered residents plus station staff." "What about emergency lockdowns?" "Lockdown protocols require authorization from Station Commander Velheron." Siveth paused. "Commander Velheron is not responding to comm contact. His second is also non-responsive. Security is attempting to reach the tertiary command officer." "How long until the shield fails?" Siveth looked at the display. "At current degradation rate, between 9 and 14 minutes. Ray set down his thermos. He unclipped his tablet and pulled up the station's schematic, not the official one, but the annotated version he'd built himself over 11 months of fixing things that weren't on the official maps. He found what he was looking for: the emergency bulkhead controls for C corridor, last serviced 4 months ago by himself, which meant he knew exactly what condition they were in. "Okay," he said. "I'm going to close the emergency bulkheads between C corridor and level 4. That'll give us a secondary barrier even if the shield goes. And I need someone to get me the manual override codes for the emitter array, because if I can get into the tertiary power distribution, I might be able to reroute enough draw to bump the shield up to maybe 40%. Siveth was quiet for a moment. "Maintenance Technician Okafor, that course of action is not within your designated function." Ray looked at Siveth, not impatiently, not with anger, the way you look at someone you've known long enough to be honest with. "Siveth," he said, "with respect, how long are we going to wait for someone in their appropriate function to show up?" Another pause. Something shifted in Siveth's posture, not surrender exactly, but a recalculation. "The manual override codes are in the Emergency Protocol Database, Category 7 authorization. My clearance level is sufficient to access them. I will retrieve them." "Good," Ray said, "and someone needs to go to level 4 and tell those people to move toward the interior sections. Calmly, without starting a panic. Can your team do that?" Siveth looked at the other 3 administrators, looked back at Ray. "We can." "Then let's go," Ray said and picked up his toolkit. He got the bulkheads closed first. That was the most important thing. The C corridor emergency bulkheads were 4 heavy pressure doors designed to isolate the docking section from the habitat areas in case of hull breach, and they hadn't been tested in 8 months, and 2 of them required manual persuasion to close because the magnetic lock tracks had accumulated enough particulate buildup to create friction. Ray fixed them. It took a wrench, 2 manual override ports, and 11 minutes that he did not really have, but he fixed them. The shield was at 4% when Siveth reached him through the comm unit. "The emitter array tertiary access is in junction box 7C9, Siveth said. "I am transmitting the override code now. However, Maintenance Technician Okafor, I must inform you of a development." Ray was already moving. What kind of developments? "The Kethavar breachcraft have not targeted the C corridor emitters exclusively. They have been running simultaneous pulse attacks on the docking clamps for berths 7, 8, and 9. This appears to have been a distraction measure. 3 Kethavar personnel have breached the station through maintenance hatch 7B, which was not shielded." Ray stopped walking. "They're already inside," he said. "Yes, Security Officer Perk has confirmed visual. They are in Maintenance Corridor 7G, that is." "That's between me and Junction 7C9, Ray said. "Oh yes." He stood in the corridor and breathed for a moment. He was holding a tablet, a torque wrench, and his toolkit. He was wearing an orange safety vest. The Kethavar personnel were presumably armed. He thought about turning around. He thought about it seriously and completely, the way he thought about problems that needed solving rather than problems that needed avoiding, which was the only way he'd ever been able to think about things since he was about 22 years old, and had decided that the person he was trying to avoid being wasn't actually any safer than the person he was trying to become. He thought about 4,000 people on the other side of a pressure bulkhead that would hold for maybe an hour before the Kethavar found the manual release. "Ask Siveth," he said, "what's the alternate route to 7C9? Through the upper crawlspace access in C corridor itself. However, it requires passing through the area now occupied by Kethavar personnel on the way back, and the crawlspace maintenance technician Okafor was not designed for." "I know the crawlspace," Ray said. He'd spent 3 hours in it in February replacing an atmospheric sensor array that kept giving false vacuum readings. He knew exactly how not designed for humans it was. He also knew every access point along its length. "I'm going through the crawlspace." "Maintenance technician Okafor, I need you to do something for me," Ray said, and his voice had gone quieter not because he was scared, but because he was concentrating. "I need you to get on every comm channel you have access to and tell security that there are hostiles in Maintenance Corridor 7G, and then I need you to keep updating me on where they're going." A pause that felt longer than it probably was. "Understood," Siveth said. "Raymond, be careful." It was the first time Siveth had used his first name in 11 months. Ray climbed into the crawlspace. What followed was 40 minutes that he never talked about in much detail afterward. Not because they were too dramatic, but because they mostly weren't. They were 40 minutes of moving through a maintenance crawlspace in the dark with a tablet for light, trying to not make sound, sweating through his safety vest, and occasionally stopping to listen to the footsteps of Kethavar soldiers moving through the corridor below him, while Siveth fed him updates in a whisper-quiet comm connection. He was afraid, that's worth saying plainly. He was a 53-year-old maintenance contractor from Columbus, Ohio, and he was afraid. And his hands were not entirely steady when he reached junction 7C9 and crouched in 12 inches of vertical clearance trying to connect his tablet to the tertiary power distribution override. The emitter array was at 0% when he started. Dead. The breach craft on the other side had done their job and C corridor's outer shield was gone. But the junction at 7C9 connected to the secondary ring, and the secondary ring wasn't targeted, and if he could redirect enough power from the secondary array and the emergency reserves to create an active field projection over the C corridor breach point, even a partial one, it would buy time. It wouldn't stop the Kethavar who were already inside, but it would stop reinforcements. It would make the breach more costly. It would matter. The override codes Siveth had given him were for the standard tertiary controls, but the standard tertiary controls had been modified during the last expansion, and the modification wasn't in the official documentation. Ray had found the modification 7 months ago while chasing a power surge, and he'd made a note in his personal tablet because he'd thought it might be relevant someday. He pulled up that note while 3 Kethavar soldiers were somewhere in the corridor 15 feet below him. The note said, "Secondary ring control requires manual bypass at relay junction B7 before engaging override. Otherwise system reads as unauthorized access and locks out for 30 min. Don't forget." He had not forgotten. He bypassed the relay. He engaged the override. He sat in the crawlspace and watched his tablet screen and very carefully redistributed power across an emitter array that wasn't designed to work this way, and brought the outer shield at C corridor back to 37%. Not perfect, not enough to stop everything, but enough. "Siveth," he said quietly. "I see it," Siveth said, and then, after a moment, "The breach craft are breaking off. A 37% shield is insufficient for their boarding protocols. They are withdrawing to assault range. That's going to buy maybe 20 minutes before they recalibrate and try again. Collective security forces are 11 minutes away. They received our distress signal. A pause. And Raymond, security officer Perk has located the 3 Kethavar personnel inside the station. They are between you and the nearest exit from the crawl space. Ray looked at the access hatch above him, looked at the access hatch below him, thought. Tell Perk they're in 7G maintenance corridor, between access points 7G4 and 7G7, moving toward the emergency bulkheads. She knows she has 2 officers. The Kethavar are armed with Class 3 disruption weapons. I know, Ray thought some more. Tell her I can come out at 7G6 and create a distraction from the west end. It'll give her angles she doesn't have from the east. Silence on the comm line. Then maintenance technician Okafor. I am required to advise you that what you are proposing it is not. Oh yes, as I know. Another silence. I will relay the information to Officer Perk. Tell her to give me 90 seconds from when I open the hatch. He didn't have a weapon. What he had was a torque wrench, a toolkit, and 11 months of knowing exactly where every access point, pipe junction, and pressure valve in this maintenance corridor was located. He had specifically the knowledge that pressure valve 7G14 was a manual release valve for the section of atmospheric processing that served the docking corridor, and that releasing it would produce a sound like a small explosion, and a cloud of recirculated air that would be startling and disorienting for approximately the same amount of time it would take Officer Perk and her team to move from the east access to firing position. It was not a particularly good plan. Ray knew it was not a particularly good plan. It was the plan he had. He counted to 90 seconds in his head, opened the access hatch, and released valve 7G14. The sound was enormous in the enclosed space. The air came out in a gray-white rush. Ray pressed himself against the wall, and for 3 seconds the maintenance corridor was full of noise and chaos, and he heard shouting in a language he didn't know, and he heard Officer Perk's team moving fast from the far end, and he closed his eyes and just stayed exactly where he was and didn't move, because moving would make him a target and not moving was the only strategy he had left. Well, the shouting stopped. Well, he opened his eyes. Perk's team had 2 of them. The third was 3 meters away from Ray, weapon raised, and looking at him with the kind of focused assessment that Ray had never been looked at before and found deeply unpleasant. The Kethavar soldier said something. Ray didn't speak Kethavar. I'm just the maintenance guy, Ray said. His voice came out mostly steady. Whatever you're planning here, it's not going to work. Security forces are 8 minutes out. Your breach craft have already pulled back. You're done. The soldier said something else. I don't know what that means, Ray said. But I'm still going to stand here because there are 4,000 people on the other side of those bulkheads, and I'm not moving. He had thought about what he would say in this moment, in the abstract way that people think about things they hope will never happen, and what he'd always imagined was something dramatic and meaningful, something that captured what he felt. What actually came out was that, simple, almost flat, the way it sounds when you've made a decision so completely that there's no performance left in it, only fact. The Kethavar soldier looked at him, really looked at him, in a way that felt like it lasted much longer than it probably did. Then Perk's third officer came through the hatch behind the soldier, and that was the end of the corridor incident. Ray sat down on the maintenance floor with his back against the wall, and his hands finally shook, and he let them. Collective security forces arrived 7 minutes later, which was 4 minutes after Ray had stopped shaking, and 2 minutes after he'd found that his coffee was, somehow, still faintly warm. He drank it sitting on the floor of maintenance corridor 7G while the station made the slow transition from crisis to aftermath. The particular organized chaos of security sweeps and medical teams and status assessments that fills the space where catastrophe was and isn't anymore. The senior security commander was a Veth named Tel Versh, and Tel Versh had been briefed on the shield restoration and the corridor confrontation, and Tel Versh had questions for Ray. Many questions, asked with the precise, formal intensity that the Veth brought to anything that had deviated from expected parameters, which the last 2 hours had done comprehensively. Most of the questions had to do with what Ray's role was technically in what had occurred. Tel Versh was not hostile. Tel Versh was genuinely trying to understand, in the way that the Veth always genuinely tried to understand things that didn't fit their frameworks, because the alternative was to pretend the thing hadn't happened, and the Veth found willful ignorance aesthetically offensive. "You are classified as Infrastructure Maintenance Class 4, Tel Versh said. "Your responsibility designation covers physical systems in the Level 7 maintenance zones. Your authorization extends to emergency system operation in the event of direct threat to those systems. It does not extend to." Tel Versh consulted something on their tablet. "Shield emitter override, military asset redistribution, tactical coordination with security personnel," or another pause, as if the next item was particularly surprising, "direct physical confrontation with armed hostiles." "I know," Ray said. "Then why did you do those things?" Ray turned the thermos in his hands. "Because someone had to." There were authorized personnel whose function encompasses those responsibilities. "They weren't there." "They were not there," Tel Versh agreed, and the agreement seemed to cost something, because it required acknowledging something that the system preferred not to acknowledge about itself. "Our response times and communication protocols failed at several junctures. The commander's absence has been noted. The secondary authorization delays are being reviewed." "Good," Ray said. "That stuff should get fixed." "Maintenance technician Okafor." Tel Versh set down the tablet. Something in the formality of the Veth's posture had changed, not loosened exactly, but oriented differently, the way a lens shifts when the object of focus changes. "I am going to ask you something, and I ask it genuinely, not as part of a formal review. I have spoken with Administrator S. Siveth, who worked alongside you during this incident. I have reviewed the security logs. I understand what you did. I do not understand why." A pause. "Humans have a concept, I have read about it, but reading about it is not the same as understanding it. The concept that one might take an action not because it is one's designated role, not because one is required to, not because the outcome benefits oneself, but because." Tel Versh stopped. "We have no word for it in Veth. Our linguists have tried. They translate it as Velhamath, but that means misaligned function, which carries a negative valence, and I do not think that is what you were doing." Ray thought about this. He thought about Elena's volleyball pictures on the inside of his locker. He thought about the cold ration paste in the Level 4 dispensers and the work order that kept getting deprioritized. He thought about the way S. Siveth had said his first name. "There's a word in an old language," he said. "Latin dignitas." It means," he paused, "it means there are things that are worth doing because of what it costs to not do them, not because you'll be rewarded, not because it's your job, because not doing it turns you into someone you can't respect." He set down the thermos. "Those 4,000 people in Level 4, if I'd walked away and they'd gotten hurt, I'd have known I walked away. I'd have to carry that. It would have cost me more than the risk did." Tel Versh was quiet for a long time. "We have a concept," Tel Versh said finally, "called Velthon, appropriate function. The idea that dignity comes from performing one's designated role with perfect precision. I have believed this my entire adult life. It is the foundation of how the collective organizes itself." Another pause. "What you have described it is not Velthon, it is almost the opposite. You are saying that dignity comes not from your role, but from your—" the Veth word came out rough, imprecise. "From the inside." "From what you carry." "Something like that," Ray said. Tel Versh looked at him for a moment with an expression that Ray couldn't fully read. "That is a destabilizing idea, maintenance technician Okafor." Yeah, Ray said, I've noticed it makes people uncomfortable. The formal review took 3 weeks. Ray spent most of it continuing his shift, fixing the things on his work order list, drinking his coffee. The station was quieter, the Kethavar had not returned, and the sector patrol presence had increased enough that another assault was assessed as unlikely. The refugee processing continued. Life on Dock 7 resumed its rhythm of controlled chaos and institutional cleaner, and the slow, important work of moving frightened people towards somewhere safer. Siveth came to find him on the 19th day, while he was replacing a pressure coupling in Maintenance Corridor 7A. The review board has completed its assessment, Siveth said. Ray sat back on his heels and, your contract with Helix Infrastructure Solutions is being terminated. Well, he'd expected this, he nodded. However, Siveth continued, the Collective Station Authority has issued a direct employment offer. The role is classified as Siveth checked their tablet. They have created a new classification. It is called Velhamathon, which means roughly function without appropriate boundary. The position carries the same pay grade as a senior security liaison, full station access authorization, and the explicit responsibility to another check. Perform any action necessary to ensure the welfare of station residents without restriction by functional category. The role has never existed before in the collective administrative framework. Ray looked at Siveth. They invented a whole job category. Yes, the debate within the Administrative Council was apparently extensive. There were those who argued that a concept such as yours could not be institutionalized without losing its essence. There were others who argued that the alternative was to pretend the breach of Outer Dock 7 did not reveal a genuine structural gap. Siveth paused. In the end, the argument that prevailed was this: that a category which exists only for beings who would act without being assigned to act is, paradoxically, a category that will never be filled by anyone motivated by the category itself. Ray thought about this. That's almost philosophy. Administrator Telversh has become somewhat philosophical since your conversation. Siveth's posture shifted just slightly. The offer is, of course, yours to refuse. I am aware that your original reason for accepting the Dock 7 posting involved a desire for distance from personal difficulties, and that those difficulties may have changed in the interim. Ray thought about Alina. She'd sent him a video 3 days ago, not of a volleyball game, but of herself sitting on her bed, telling him that she'd gotten into the engineering program she'd applied for, and that she'd started to think maybe some of his patience with broken things had rubbed off on her, and that she thought he should know that. He'd watched it 6 times. I have to make a call first, Ray said, and then I'll let you know. He made the call. Alina answered on the second ring, which she hadn't done in over a year, and he told her about the offer. And she was quiet for a moment, and then she sighed. With the precision of someone who has thought about things carefully, Dad, if you come home because you think you should, you're going to be miserable and it'll be my fault. If you stay because there are people there who need you, I'm going to miss you, but I'll understand. Just don't do either one because it's what you're supposed to do. He'd raised her well. He hadn't been sure for a while, but he'd raised her well. He found Siveth the next morning. I'll take the job, he said. The consequences of the breach of Outer Dock 7 spread further than Ray knew, and in directions he didn't expect. Telversh had returned to the Collective Administrative Council after the incident with something that the Veth around them described, in careful language, as a Vel-Kuron, a framework uncertainty, the state of holding a belief that has been disrupted by evidence and not yet resolved into a new belief. It was apparently unusual for a senior commander to experience this openly. The Veth valued precision, and Vel-Kuron was considered a private state, worked through quietly and alone. Telversh had chosen to work through it in public. In the quarterly review of collective refugee processing protocols, Telversh had submitted a supplementary document that was not standard and that caused considerable discussion. The document addressed the structural gap that the breach had exposed, not just the security gap, though it addressed that too, but the conceptual gap. The gap between a system designed around precise role assignment and the actual messy reality of crisis, which did not ask credentials before arriving. The document used a word that had not appeared in a formal collective administrative filing before: Velhamathon, function without appropriate boundary. It recommended not just the position they'd created for Ray, but a systematic review of whether the rigid category structures that gave the collective its organizational precision might also be creating specific, predictable points of failure. It was not a popular document. It was, however, a very hard document to argue with because it came with a specific case study and a body count that was 0, when it could very easily have been 4,000. Over the following months, 3 other processing stations in the sector quietly created similar roles. None of them found anyone quite like Ray to fill them, but the act of creating the category changed something, the way that naming a thing changes how you can think about it. The collective began slowly, with the characteristic caution of a civilization that had spent several thousand years building systems, specifically designed to be slow and careful, to develop the capacity to imagine that appropriate function might include doing whatever the situation required. Ray didn't know most of this. He knew his work order list and the layout of Dock 7's maintenance corridors, and the names of the children in Level 4 who had developed a habit of waving at him when he came through on his rounds. He knew that S. Siveth had started calling him Raymond, not as a slip but as a choice, and that Telversh had made a point of stopping by Dock 7 twice since the incident, both times during shift hours, and spending about 20 minutes asking him questions that had nothing to do with formal review and everything to do with genuine curiosity. He knew that one of the children in Level 4, a girl of about 8 years old, species Kelhari, who had arrived at the station 3 months after the breach with her mother and 2 younger siblings, had somehow decided that he was a person worth talking to. Her name was Vesa. She had very large eyes and an extremely firm grasp of what she wanted, which seemed to be, in roughly equal measure, answers to complicated questions and access to his coffee thermos, which she found fascinating despite finding the contents disgusting. She asked him once, in the halting trade dialect that she was learning with the speed that children learn things when they have motivation, why he had stayed during the breach. Someone had told her the story children in processing centers hear everything, passing information between themselves with the focused intensity of people who have very little else and understand that information is a resource. She knew some version of what had happened. She wanted to know why. He thought about how to answer her in terms she'd understand. He thought about Dignitas and Velhamathon and everything Telversh had said about destabilizing ideas. Some things, he said, are worth doing because of what it costs you not to do them. Vesa considered this. What does it cost you to run away? A piece of yourself, Ray said, the piece that thinks you're someone worth being. She chewed on this for a while, then, my mother rant. He was careful with what came next. From what? From where we lived when the soldiers came, she ran with us. Vesa L. Looked at him. Did she lose a piece of herself? Ray took a moment. What did she run toward? Vesa didn't answer immediately. He could see her working through it, the methodical honesty of a child who doesn't have the habits of comfortable self-deception yet. Us, she said finally. Then no, Ray said. She ran toward something, not away from something. That's not the same. Vesa seemed to accept this with the pragmatic efficiency of someone who has more questions than they have time for and has learned to file answers and move on. She asked him if she could hold the torque wrench, which she always asked, and which he always let her because she was careful with it and seemed to find its weight reassuring in a way he didn't ask about. The formal end of the review process came on a Thursday afternoon. Ray was informed by message rather than in person, which was how the collective handled things. He read it at his maintenance workstation, noted that his new employment classification had been officially entered into the station registry, and that the breach of Outer Dock 7 had been recorded in the Collective Administrative Archive as a case study in adaptive response under structural failure, and set the tablet down. Siveth came by his workstation about an hour later. Not for any particular reason, not carrying a work order or a review document. Just stopping by, which was not something Siveth had done before the breach and had started doing after it, in the tentative way that people acquire new habits they haven't named yet. "The review is closed," Ray said. "Yes," Siveth stood for a moment. "I wanted to ask you something not related to the review." "Go ahead." "During the incident, when you were in the crawl space and you knew the Kethavar personnel were below you, I was monitoring your comm channel." A pause. "You were humming." Ray blinked. "I was." "Yes, a song. I did not recognize it. I looked through collective databases of human music, but the parameters were insufficient for identification. I could not determine what it was." Ray thought about it. He hadn't been conscious of doing it. He'd been concentrating on the junction controls, and his hands had been occupied, and he supposed that when he was occupied and not thinking about the things he was afraid of, he hummed. "It was an old song," he said. "My mother used to sing it when she was working. I never knew the name of it either. I just picked it up from her." Siveth was quiet for a moment. Is that common, carrying a sound from someone else without knowing what it is? Ray thought about Alina's voice on the phone, about his mother's hands and the shape of her in the kitchen of their house on Maple Street, and the particular way sound travels in memory, warming as it goes. "Yeah," he said, "I think it's pretty common. You carry a lot from people without knowing you're doing it." Siveth looked at him, then carefully in the precise and considered way that the Veth approached anything that mattered. "I think I am beginning to understand dignitas." Ray picked up his coffee. "It takes a while," he said, "but you get there." 6 months after the breach, a small package arrived for Ray from the Collective Administrative Office on the main station. Inside was a data chip containing the formal citation that came with his new classification and a handwritten note from Telversh that said, in Veth script translated into a clumsy but earnest human common tongue, "You have given us a word we did not have. A concept has more weight when it has a face." And under the data chip, wrapped in station-standard packing material, was a small object that Ray didn't immediately understand. It was a flat disk of woven material in dark blue and silver, about the size of his palm. He turned it over. It was a Kelhari work blessing. He'd seen them before, worn on the wrist or hung above a workspace, given to someone whose work mattered. The pattern on it was the Kelhari symbol for the ones who hold the line, which was a concept in their culture that predated the conflicts that had driven them from their homes, that went back to a time when it referred to farmers who stayed through drought and soldiers who held mountain passes and parents who remained when everything made more sense to flee. There was no note with it, but on the station there was only one family of Kelhari with children of braiding age, and one of those children had very large eyes and an extremely firm grasp of what she wanted. Ray looked at the blessing for a while. Then he folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of his safety vest, next to the pictures of Alina and the worn edge of a grocery list from 6 years ago that he'd never cleaned out and no longer tried to explain. He picked up his toolkit. There was a pressure coupling in corridor 7D that had been on the work order list for 2 days, and a lighting grid in level 3 that was flickering in a way that the chill Dren found frightening, and a flow regulator somewhere in the level 4 environmental system that was making a noise that wasn't right yet, but was going to be wrong soon if someone didn't catch it. He had work to do. He headed down the corridor, and somewhere between the junction at 7B and the entrance to level 3, without knowing he was doing it, he started to hum. If this story reached something in you that you didn't expect, that's what these stories are for. There's something powerful in the idea that ordinary people without titles or weapons or the right designation can be the thing that holds the line. Not because they were chosen, not because they were the strongest person in the room, but because they decided that the cost of walking away was higher than the cost of staying. Thank you for spending this time with Ray. Thank you for listening with the kind of attention that a story like this deserves. If it moved you, if it made you think about someone you know who holds their own quiet line in their own ordinary world, share it. Leave a comment. Let someone else find it. New stories post every week. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And until then, take care of each other. Somebody always needs to.